Alright, so this is the video of this week's lecture while I am out of town. Our main question that we're gonna talk about, we may not answer this question completely because this is a major ongoing question in archaeology, is what were the people like? That's a big open-ended question, like I sort of was just alluding to. So we're going to break that down, and we're actually going to only talk about a couple of different aspects of this question today. And we're going to continue addressing this partially as we address some of the other questions over the next several weeks. We're going to start with, let's say, a subset question, which is, how did people behave in the past, and why did that behavior change over time? In other words, why don't we still live like hunter-gatherers? Why do different cultures around the world exist? Why do people do things differently? How did that arise over time? And there are a variety of different theoretical viewpoints that we can use to address this particular question, but we're going to stick with one particular viewpoint, which is based in the idea that human beings are basically like other animals. We are, at least we have some aspects to us that are like other animals when we're making certain behavioral decisions. Yet, on the other hand, there are a lot of things that are different about humans. So we're going to use this idea called human ecology, and that's sort of putting humans into an environment as a way to understand why people choose to do the things that they do. Now, humans are a basic part of the environment. That's one of the basic tenets of human ecology, and we should study them in their environments, right? If we want to understand a lot of the behaviors that people do. This kind of approach is something that I like to call holistic or systems thinking, meaning you can't take something out of its natural environment, its total system, and understand it on its own. You have to observe how it interacts with all the other components. Taking people out of natural settings, out of environments, and trying to study them on their own is only capturing part of the picture. And human ecology itself, because it's focused on humans and environments, there's a strong cross-pollination between biological sciences and social sciences, and to humanities to a little bit lesser degree, but really we're trying to understand sort of the more physical aspects of people making decisions on landscapes with plants and animals and rocks and all the other things that are around them. So here's a little bit of a diagram to kind of illustrate to you what I'm talking about when I'm talking about systems and how humans and environments are interconnected, right? So on the one hand, on the left-hand side over here, we have the social system. We have a group of people, the population, with cultural stuff, including values, with knowledge, with material culture, technology, with grouping and their social organization. On the other side over here, we have another web, the ecosystem. We have air, water, plants, animals, microorganisms, structures that people built in the environment, soil, all of this kind of stuff. We actually see that these things are actually intimately connected in this sort of circular manner, right? People rely on all of these things to make a living. They make a lot of their choices about what they're going to do based on the kind of environment that they inhabit. But they do a lot of other things over here that are not related to the environment, but that could actually feed back into changing the environment over time. So this is a fairly complex picture here, and we need to build up to getting to really understand this whole concept of systems and feedback and how change can occur from all of this stuff. So we're going to start a little smaller than that. But before we do, let's just talk about some of the basic research questions that archaeologists and anthropologists who work under this big paradigm of human ecology would be interested in, right? So one of the things that I am particularly interested in my own research is how people interact with their environment, how they change the environment, and how the environment changes them, right? Other people are really interested in how cultures change over time and how culture influences physical human evolution, right? How do cultural choices influence our physical and genetic changes over long periods of time? How do people rely on culture to adapt to new circumstances that they themselves have maybe never seen before? How do people just make decisions in generally? In particular, in the past, when we were hunter-gatherers or low-level subsistence agriculturalists, how do we make decisions about subsistence, how we were going to go about ensuring that we were going to have enough food to stay alive, right? And why do people sometimes make poor decisions with disastrous consequences in many cases, right? So we're going to get actually to a few of these questions a couple of weeks down the line when we talk about how people make a living and how we know what the environment was, right? We're going to focus on a few of these sort of more basic questions over here, like interacting with the environment and how culture changes over time today. So there are a variety of sort of smaller fields of thought that fall within the larger paradigm of human ecology. Cultural ecology we're going to talk about that. It's one of the earliest branches of human ecology, and it's where a lot of this sort of ideas about cultures and change over time and all that kind of stuff comes from. We're also going to talk about cultural evolution, sometimes also part of evolutionary anthropology, sometimes they call it that way. And these are ideas about how culture changes over time. And we're going to talk about how we tie all of that stuff together in this dual inheritance and niche construction theory. And there are a few other things there, including human behavioral ecology and human ecological modeling, that we'll talk about at another time, all right? Okay. Before we get started, one last thing is that although there are differences in these sort of sub-approaches, they all must square with one basic fact, that humans are different from other animals in that we haven't used complex culture. So we are the same as other animals in the fact that we live in environments and we interact with our environments, but we are different in the fact that we have complex culture. And that's the real interesting part about studying humans and how they interact in an environment versus animals. Cultural ecology. It's, like I said, one of the sort of earliest, even before there was such a thing that was called human ecology. Cultural ecology was a school of thought that developed to try and make sense of some of the things that we now call part of human ecology. And really it was developed as a way to overcome problems with two really early ideas about human culture. The first idea was called, or at least we call now, environmental determinism. This particular train of thought was developed by a lot of scholars in the 19th century, and in particular by Lewis Henry Morgan, who had a very specific idea about different groups of people around the world who had what he would call more or less evolved cultures. We would call them more or less complex cultures. And his idea was that we started out with human evolution. We started out basically at a very low rung of the evolutionary ladder, and different groups around the world progressed in one direction up the ladder. As you got from one rung to the other, you improved, right? And the way that this happened in this deterministic viewpoint was by happening to be in an environment that was productive, all right? The idea was that, especially in this time period, European culture was at the top with full-blown civilization, and hunting and gathering cultures and parts of the world that European cultures were now colonizing were way down at the bottom in lower savagery. There were stages of lower, middle, and upper savagery, lower, middle, and upper barbarism, and eventually you got to civilization. And it was all about the environment, right, that determined how far you could go up that ladder. And the sort of idea that developed out of this was that, well, if environment is good, then you're going to have civilizations. That's why there's Greek civilization, right? If environment's bad, then you're never going to get to civilization. There were a lot of obvious problems with this viewpoint. The sort of notion that it reinforced the colonial worldview, not least among them. But even contemporaries in the 19th century also saw problems with that, because people were actually getting out and exploring the world, and they were finding like civilizations, evidence of very large civilizations in jungles where, according to environmental deterministic principles, there shouldn't have been major civilizations. So that was problematic, and an opposing, well, or at least a different school of thought developed, mainly championed by Alfred Kroeber and a few other folks here in California, up in Berkeley, with the idea that it's not necessarily the environment that determines what your culture is going to be like, but it opens up possibilities, so that if you have what they would deem a poor environment, there's only so many possibilities to adapt your culture or increase your cultural complexity. If you have a really nice environment, a really rich environment, then you have a lot more possibilities, right? And here the sort of takeaway point was that similar environments may produce similar cultures, but not necessarily. Now, this is better, perhaps, than the deterministic point of view, but it's still a little bit weak. It still doesn't really explain the variation that we would see around the world. And of course, there are a lot of issues with this sort of possibilistic idea. Like, where does the variation end? Why does it tend to turn out one way in some places and not in others? So, in the turn of the century, starting in the early 20th century, there was a lot of thinking about these ideas, a lot of trying to come up with a better way to understand why there were so many different cultures and why civilizations arose in different parts of the world. And one sort of thinker among them was a man named Julian Steward. And he spent most of his time studying the environmental adaptation of societies. He worked a little bit here in California, a lot in the Great Basin in Nevada, but also in the northwest coast in British Columbia. And he started to come up with a lot of ideas because he was in the desert working with hunter-gatherers there. He was on the rich fishing coast of the northwest coast. He was in California. He was investigating developmental sequences of civilizations in other parts of the world. And especially he was comparing the New World, the Americas, with the Old World, Eurasia and Africa, and trying to understand why things were similar and why things were different in the progression of societies in these different areas. And he didn't believe, differently from other people at the time, that cultures could only follow a sort of single sequence of development. So whereas environmental determinists and even environmental possibilists sort of saw there being a chain, a ladder to climb from the lowest rungs to the highest rungs, Steward thought that that really wasn't the way. It's not that there was a goal of civilization that societies eventually got to. He proposed that cultures could evolve in any number of distinct patterns depending on environmental circumstances and also circumstances of local cultures. And he called this idea multilinear evolution, mainly to distinguish it from those unilineal evolutionary theories, those ideas that you could only progress along a single ladder. And from this idea, he defined a theory of cultural ecology basically as the examination of the cultural adaptations formulated by human beings to meet the challenges of their environment. So here he's saying that we adapt our cultures to meet specific challenges that are posed by our environments. So the environment isn't determining what we can and we can't do. And it's a little bit more distinct than just the environment gives us possibilities. It says the environment gives us specific challenges, and then we can formulate any number of adaptations to meet those challenges. And this really opened up a really interesting avenue of research that we're still kind of following to these days. And one of the real interesting aspects that Steward included in his theory of cultural ecology was the idea that there are different parts of culture. And his idea there would be maybe more and less functional aspects of culture. He called it the culture core versus the culture non-core. For him, the culture core was the parts of a society's material culture, especially the technology, and some of the social structures and customs that allowed the society to actually interact with their environment to fix or to solve the problems that the environment posed for them. For him, that was what was most interesting. That was the thing that he was going to study, and everything else, beliefs, religions, all of that kind of stuff was the non-core. For him, it was not the interesting part of culture, right? So for him, he was really particularly interested in the interaction between the culture core and what he calls the effective environment. And that, for him, was the key to understanding how human societies change over time. So for him, it was the culture core, the natural environment, and technology. And technology for him was the component that was really going to be amenable to changing, especially rapidly as conditions changed. So here's a little diagram that he developed to show this, and you'll see that it's kind of similar to that big web that we looked at in the beginning for human ecology theory as we know it today. And really, that was this diagram here was sort of the beginning of this idea of systems of interaction. Over here on the sort of left in yellow, we have the effective environment, the natural components, the human technology, the ability to combine the two to do work and extract resources and to organize around doing that work, right? And then we have the other thing over here, which is culture. We have the culture core, which lets us do this downward arrow here, and the culture non-core, which is all the other stuff. For him, he just said that's ancillary to adaptation. And these things, in his mind, there was no reason for any of this stuff to change. It just changed because it's ancillary, okay? So that's essentially what he was proposing with his idea of cultural ecology, right? Technology is the key. It's the window through which we view our environment, through which we interact with the environment. And essentially, technology changes the way we can exploit the resources in our environment. So it's to our benefit to adapt our technology to getting things out of the environment. And that's what's going to change most rapidly. And as archaeologists, that's what we see changing very rapidly in the archaeological record. So it's a really useful thing for archaeologists. But obviously the big weakness, and I'll go back one slide here, is that he's leaving out all of this stuff over here. And we know that this stuff does more than just entertain us, right? It actually can influence some of the stuff on the other side over here. And that's the big weakness, the big critique of cultural ecology as Julian Steward developed it. And it's one of the reasons why we've extended these ideas into a broader, more inclusive paradigm of human ecology. So let's talk about that. How could those other aspects of culture change, right? We can see how technology would change as environmental conditions change, and you got to change the technology so that you can continue to make a living. But how do things like religion change? How do things like art change? How do things that don't seem functional, at least in terms of extracting resources, how do those things change over time? Are they random, or are there really underlying processes of culture change? And this has been a really wide open field of study for the last couple of decades. And there's a lot of really interesting ideas put forth. And really what we have now is sort of a body of thought that we would call cultural evolution, a theory of how culture changes over time. And there's a lot of overlap with ideas about physical evolution, about genetic change. But it's not exactly the same for culture, because culture works slightly differently, or differently than does genetic change. So let's take a look at two early ideas about the mechanism of physical evolution. And from these two opposing or competing ideas, we may understand a little bit better about how cultural evolution works. So we'll talk about Darwinian evolution, which we still use today to understand how physical bodies of animals and plants and all those things can change over time. At the time, this was controversial, but the idea was that all animals in a species are born with some, animals or plants in a species are born with some sort of inherent variation. Darwin didn't know about genes, right? Didn't know about genetic inheritance, but he still had this idea that they were born with an inherent variation, and that the animal can only pass on physical variations that it was born with, right? And that advantageous variations would provide a little bit of a survival advantage. This is the quintessential or classic idea of survival of the fittest, right? So individuals that are born with advantageous traits will have more offspring, and thus the traits that are advantageous will be passed to those offspring, who will also be very successful and have more offspring. And over time, you'll get more individuals in the species that have those traits because they are beneficial to doing whatever it is that the species is doing to make a living, right? And in his idea was basically that environment is going to change over time, and the different traits will become more or less useful as the environment changes or the species moves from one environment to the other. And you can see this is actually pretty similar to the culture core kind of aspect of technology that Julian Steward was talking about. But and this is a very well-known mechanism for physical evolution. But what's a little less known was that at the same time that Darwin was coming up with his mechanism for the process of physical evolution, there were actually competing hypotheses out there. And one of them was by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who had his own idea about how animals passed on their physical traits from one generation to the next. And unlike Darwin, who said you have to be born with that variation, Lamarck said, well, as you do things in your life, your body changes as you do them. And because you've changed your body, when you have children or you have the next generation, you pass on whatever changes you accumulated in your own lifetime. You can actually pass those on through reproduction. And over time, as individuals try and do specific activities and their bodies change in their lifetimes, and they pass that on as the starting place for the next generation, and then their bodies change over time, you can produce new species, right? So here's the two sort of classic graphics for these two different ideas. You have Darwin's finches over here, where basically there was initial variation in beak size among his finches when they showed up in the Galapagos Islands, and depending on which islands they inhabited and which resources they went after, they either ended up with little thin beaks that were great for grabbing grubs and insects, or real thick beaks that were useful for crushing seeds and that kind of stuff. But they had to start with an initial variation, and they could only pass on those variants that were successful at those tasks, right? And they had to be born with it. Here is Lamarck's argument about the giraffe's neck, such that the early giraffes had kind of shorty little necks, and they ate the lowest leaves. But as they ate the leaves, they had to stretch their necks up high so they get the next level leaves. And during their lifetime, their neck would extend by a couple of inches. And when they had offspring, they would pass on somehow that extra couple of inches. And as those offspring ate the leaves, they would stretch their necks more, and they would stretch and stretch and stretch, and eventually you get the long neck of the giraffe through continual stretching in the life of the giraffe. Well, we know now that physical evolution works basically the way Darwin came up with, and not at all the way that Lamarck went up with. That is, you cannot pass on, if you're a bodybuilder, you're not going to have a baby that comes out with jacked muscles, right? You're going to come out with a normal baby who's going to have to lift its own weights if it wants to get muscles. Now, what's really interesting, however, is when we start to look at culture non-core, the other things, we start to realize that they can actually change in a Lamarckian way, right? Not like Darwin's way. It's not like we're born with our entire culture in our brains. We have to learn that we learn that from our parents and from other people, and we actually inherit all the funny things that they've come up with in their life, right? We can actually inherit things that they did in their life. Sorry about that. So cultural evolution is not Darwinian, right? It more closely follows the Lamarckian idea of evolution. Not exactly the same, as Lamarck proposed, but much more closely to that, in that we can actually inherit things that our parents did during their lifetimes. Culturally, we can inherit those things. All right. So, how then might individual aspects of culture, of the non-culture core, then change as I inherit them over time? Well, this is interesting. We have a variety of mechanisms here. Processes that induce change, some that restrict change, right? Some processes operate inside a society, and some processes are imposed on a society from the outside of it. And all of these processes must be squared to some mechanism of cultural change. So we'll get to the actual mechanism. First, we'll take a look at the processes that we're talking about that induce, restrict change, and that are internal and external to societies. So here are some internal processes that can lead to change. Invention, right? As we come up with new cultural items, this can be technological things to solve problems that look nicer, that kind of stuff, or ideological things, ideas, beliefs, that kind of stuff. Cultural loss, the loss of cultural items and ideas can cause change too. This could be due to the fact that people just sort of stopped using things. Something new was invented. We have our iPhones now. We don't use our landline phones quite so much. Eventually, landline phones may drop out of our culture, right? This is one way. Direct replacement, an invention or something else that directly replaces one piece of technology with the other, or one idea with the other. In particular, essentially something that does something similar functionally in the society can quickly replace the other thing, and then you lose the other thing. People who know how to do stuff can die, for example, die off and not have taught somebody of the next generation how to do things. We can also have processes from outside of society that lead to change. Diffusion, a direct movement of ideas or things from one group of people to another. This is really common over shared borders where two cultural groups come into contact. This can happen through trade, which actually exchanging physical things and ideas as we do that. Immigration from one area to the other. Conflict, warfare, certainly can act to move ideas and things, especially if we're in conflict with another group and we want to outdo them. We see that they have a better, let's say, weapon of war. We want to make a better one than that, so we'll borrow their weapon of war and we'll improve on it, right? Another process is called acculturation. This is diffusion of an entire culture from one group of people to another. Conflict is a big source of that, especially when there are winners and losers. If one group conquers another group and they'll inflict their way of life on the other culture, this is very common. Large-scale immigration can do this too. You got a large number of people moving from one place to the other. They can swamp out a local culture, bringing their own with it. Transculturation is another outside force that can lead to change. This is when one individual moves from a culture that they grew up in into another, and they're sort of replacing their own culture with the new culture. It usually happens with individual immigrants from one to another, right? And environmental processes, climate change, natural disasters, migration, all of these things we've been talking about can absolutely lead to new inventions in cultural aspects as well as technological aspects. And then there's stimulus diffusion, where you actually know an idea came from outside, but then you really adapted it and changed it, because you didn't really know what it did. And the most famous of this is the Cherokee alphabet, where Tecumseh knew that the English, he called all of the Euro-American colonists, could pass messages by scribbling things on paper. He had no idea what that was. He didn't know what writing was. He didn't learn about writing from the English, right? So he basically gathered up some letters and sort of looked at them and came up with his own system to take the Cherokee language and to put it down as well. So it's sort of an almost independent invention of an alphabet, but with some prior knowledge. So that's what's called stimulus diffusion. And so those are all processes that sort of lead to change. There are other processes that work to resist change. One of the main ones is what we call cultural conservatism. And what this is resistance to change due to tradition. Basically, it's the idea that we've always done it this way. Even if it's not the best way, it's the way we do it. So we don't want to change. It's just a psychological aspect of human beings. In particular, if there's a tight integration of social things that we have to do with ideological beliefs and environmental stability and all of this kind of stuff, says, look, there's no reason to change what we want to do. So if you've invented something, even if it's a little bit better, we're not going to do that, all right? So that's one way we can resist change. Another way is intergroup competition. This is basically a sort of ramping up of the us versus them feeling, so that we need to distinguish why we're different from the other group. So even if we get a new idea come into our society, we're going to say, look, that's not us, because if we change that, it's going to make us more similar to this other group. So it's similar to cultural conservatism, but with a slightly different motivation that underlies it. Okay, so that was the processes of change from inside and outside environment. What are the actual mechanisms for a specific change to take place? And basically, we have to look at how we learn about culture, how we learn to function in a society. Essentially, we have three different mechanisms for doing that. Teaching by a pedagogue. So in this moment, I'm your pedagogue, I'm your teacher, and I'm telling you how archaeology works. Copying from an archetype. Basically, this is somebody you look up to in society and you say, look, they've really figured this out. I'm going to do exactly what they do, and that's how I'm going to know what to do in society. And then observation of participants. And this is trying to do something and looking around and saying, oh, well, it looks like those people over there are having some success, so maybe I'll kind of follow what they're doing and I'll learn how to do that by just watching them do it successfully, right? And what's really interesting about all three of these things is that neither the pedagogue, the archetype, nor the participant needs to be my parents, right? I'm not your parent, yet you are learning things from me, right? Your peers are not your parents, yet you learn things by observing them. The sports star that you look up to and that you want to emulate is not your parent, yet you copy things that they do, right? Although obviously, especially early on in life, our parents will be our first sources of all of these things. They are not at all the only thing we're limited to. So this is very different from physical evolution in that we can actually inherit culture through these mechanisms and the other processes from anybody in our society and from outside our society. This is the major difference between cultural evolution and biological evolution. Okay, so some connections, right? Now, this is all well and good. Okay, I'm teaching you, you're listening, you're copying your sports star, you're observing your participants. But I'll bet you make mistakes. And I'm not putting anybody to blame here. I'm not calling anybody out. Everybody does this. You don't write down everything that I say. You can't remember it. And I don't expect you to, right? You may mishear something that I'm telling you and think I said one thing when I said something else. By following your favorite sports star and buying the same clothing that he or she wears, the same car, the same house or whatever it is, you're biasing who you're copying, right? There may be a more sensible person that you should be copying, but you don't actually do that because you can't actually see the other person because you have a preference for that particular archetype, right? And in fact, just because you happen to have a certain group of friends who do things one way, you may be just getting some bias due to probability, right? You just happen to be in a small group of people who do things one way, even though in the rest of American society we do it a variety of other ways, right? There are a lot of ways to actually insert error into this sort of teaching or copying or learning activities, right? And each one of us has agency, our ability to choose or ignore certain things that we're learning or copying, right? So all of these things work together to fuddle the message between one generation and the next. So all the process of learning is imperfect. And as we do that, as we make these mistakes, we can actually, mistakes or these weird issues of probability and copying, that kind of stuff, can actually make certain cultural components increase in frequency or decrease in frequency over time without any real functional aspect, meaning they don't have to be how we interact with our environment, how we make a living. It can be just an amalgamation of these kind of mistakes or probabilities over time, and we can get vastly different cultures evolving out of that. All right, so that's basically where we're at right now in terms of understanding how cultures change. There's a big critique of this, which is, well, then how did we evolve culture in the first place, right? And also, what's more important? Is culture more important, or is our physical evolution, natural environment, more important? And also, don't we change the environment that we live in, both culturally and physically in the world? How does that feed back into this whole process of cultural change? And this is something that's really been developed in the last 10 years or so, a more holistic viewpoint, something called the dual inheritance theory. And this is the idea that humans inherit both genes and culture from their social group. So we're not isolated physically, genetically, in a physical evolutionary way from our cultural evolution and vice versa, right? So this is a really important factor for amplifying certain changes, especially those that benefit the group, because we're working in little social groups. So for dual inheritance theory to work, physical evolution has to be kind of functioning maybe more at the group level than at the individual level for humans, and that the fidelity of transmission depends both on individual adaptations, learning, and on the developmental environment, the learning environment in our social group, which includes our natural environment. Our ability to have and use culture feeds back into the environment, meaning we can modify the environment to better suit our physical and cultural evolutionary needs. So, according to the dual inheritance theory, human social groups are the most interesting units of evolutionary adaptation, both for the physical evolution and for cultural evolution. And this idea, dual inheritance theory, has some sort of offshoots or some predictions that it should make. And one of these things is called niche construction, or niche construction theory. And this is the idea that we modify our ecological niche. Not just us, other organisms do this too. Basically, it can be thought of as a fundamental process of evolution in its own right, in that we are physically fundamentally changing the world around us to better suit our needs. This is a very different type of adaptation than changing our culture, changing our technology. Instead, we're changing the world, right? Niche construction is talks about the ability to create feedback between an organism and its environment, and it is ecological inheritance, right? It is the dual inheritance, the second half of the dual inheritance. So let's take a look, right? Over here on the left, we have standard evolutionary theory, right? We have time going this way, right? At time one, there's some sort of environment doing natural selection on our gene pool. Survival of the fittest happens. A new gene pool exists. At time two, the environment is what it is, and you get another round of selection over and over and over again, and evolution goes like that. Here, the niche construction, or the dual inheritance, extended evolutionary theory, suggests that at time one, you have the environment, and it goes and does do selection, survival of the fittest, but at the same time, you have the group over here saying, you know what, that environment was harsh. I want to make it a little nice. So we inherit the genes over time, but then we also inherit the changed environment, so that this environment is fundamentally different from that environment, as is the gene pool. And then this happens again. So at each time step, you got this feedback between changing the gene pool and changing the environment. And so you can see in this case, not only is the environment changing over time as a result of human action, so is the gene pool, because it's feeding back at each additional time step. So we can actually have much faster evolution in both of these two aspects with this, which is really interesting. This is really changing the way we see human evolution. And here we go. We have the feedbacks all set up here. So just another diagram that's sort of showing some of the same things. We can change our culture now too. So we can change our genes, we can change our culture, and we can change our environment. And because there are 3 avenues for change, that really shows us that change is really what's going to happen. We're going to change physically, we're going to change culturally, and we're going to change the world around us. And all these things are interlinked together. And in fact, we have good evidence that this kind of stuff happens. Here we have a really interesting thing. This is something called adult hypolactasia. This is the ability to digest lactase, the enzyme in milk. In past the time when we are infants, when we are supposed to drink milk from our mothers, all babies of all mammalian species are able to digest lactase as babies. So I'll just turn the phone off. Okay. But as we grow past a certain age, or animals lose the ability to digest those enzymes. But here we see in humans, after we domesticated animals like goats and sheep and cows, and the milk became a really important food source for us, that essentially societies that have a long history of dairying, of using dairy animals and drinking milk, have a much greater instance of this adult hypolactasia, the ability to digest lactose into adulthood. So essentially we changed our environment by domesticating the animals. We changed our culture to adapt to milking those animals and making things like cheese and yogurt and all that kind of stuff. And our physical bodies changed to make that happen. Okay, so where does that leave us, right? 3 concepts of inheritance: genetic, cultural, and ecological. The idea that transmission between generations is messy and prone to change. The idea that everything feeds back to affect everything else. And we're also now thinking in terms of systems and dynamics, that everything is linked and that change derives not only from one component of the links, but through the interactions themselves. We can only study cultural change through the archaeological record if we have the appropriate theory to guide us, and we're getting really close with this new triple component here of genetic, cultural, and ecological change. All right, so let's take a break, and then we'll come back and we'll do bioarchaeology. So I encourage you to just pause the movie at this particular point and then go off and come back. And I'm actually going to pause and drink some water myself. Okay, so we're back. I had some water. Now I can speak a little bit better. So let's get back to bioarchaeology. I hope you had a nice break as well. So this is totally switching gears, and this is kind of useful. This is going to be useful for your lab when you're looking at Ötzi the Iceman, who is the best preserved deceased human being that we've ever found to this date. All right, and the study of Ötzi's body and his artifacts that were found around him that you'll find as you do the lab really falls under this new sort of sub-branch of archaeology called bioarchaeology. All right, this is related to forensic anthropology, in that it's sort of studying about death and the cause of death and some other things surrounding death. But it's different in that we're actually looking at archaeological case studies, and we're trying to understand not just about the human populations, the physical nature of ancient human populations, but also about their attitudes and beliefs towards death and the afterlife and this kind of stuff. So it's a really rich area of study, and really very fascinating area of study, right? Okay, so bioarchaeological research, that little thing should have popped up there. Bioarchaeological research essentially looks at a variety of things. You can focus on any one of these things. Growth and development in different times and different places, right? How, for example, how old did people live to? What was the life expectancy in different time places? What were the reasons behind that? With disease, lifestyle, genetics, that kind of stuff. Disease and pathologies, the study of the evolution of human disease, for sure. Like, for example, smallpox, tuberculosis, all of these kind of communicable diseases that some of them leave distinct markings on the skeleton, and they can be studied. Trauma, injury, and violence, right? Understanding warfare in the past, understanding violence among early societies, understanding the reasoning behind warfare and violence, right? Well, if we see an increase, is there some social reason behind that? Understanding what people did physically. The activities that we do on a daily basis leave indelible marks on our skeletons. We can get arthritis from repetitive activities. If we have strong muscles, we leave markings on our bones where the tendons attached to them. We can damage ligaments, from doing repetitive activities. So we can absolutely understand physical activity patterns. Cranial and dental functions is a big analysis too. Do teeth wear in certain ways because of diet, right? Aspects about human skull deformation and all kinds of stuff like that. Signatures of health and diet. We can look inside the bones themselves and look at chemical traces to see what kinds of plants and animals people were eating in the past and whether they were starved or not. We can definitely extract ancient DNA, and we can understand how our DNA has changed over time. We can also try and understand issues surrounding cultural patrimony, meaning, for example, with Kennewick Man, which just recently was resolved, was this person really related to modern-day Native Americans, or was this person something different? And we, through genetic analysis and bioarchaeological analysis, just recently found out that Kennewick Man does have a modern set of descendants. In particular, it was decided that the Colville tribe of Spokane, near Spokane, is the Kennewick Man's most likely group of descendants, and we were able to repatriate Kennewick Man's remains to the group. And of course, there are broader theoretical issues too. For example, demography, migration, all kinds of stuff we can learn from studying burials and human bones. So let's take a look at a couple of these things and sort of see what bioarchaeology is kind of about, right? So we'll start here with demography, and we'll just go through all of this stuff so it comes up here. Demography is the sort of science of understanding variation in populations, right? These are things like sex or gender ratios, how many males to females, age ranges, so how many people are alive that reached 80, how many people reached 60, how many people reached 50, right? So we have this mortality curve that we can get from studying burials. Various anomalies, for example, people who are born with disabilities but kept alive longer. That's a really interesting demographic concept. Kept alive longer than they would without help is what I meant there. Stable isotope analysis lets us do this, and basically what this is the food that you eat contains particular atoms that have a sort of signature to them. They're not normal atoms. They're heavier in some way. In particular, there are certain elements that are really useful for looking at this. Strontium is one of them. Nitrogen is one of them. Carbon is one of them. We'll learn more about this when we talk about the environmental, or how we understand what the environment was like and what people were eating. But basically, we can analyze those isotopes to basically see what they were eating in the past, but also where they came from. If they were born in one place and they moved to another, their bones are going to look different on the chemical level than people who were born in the place that they died, right? And of course, DNA and genomic research are really important. Of course, we tie all of this with archaeological data, the kind of stuff that we've been talking about in general. So demography is the main focus of bioarchaeology. Another is actually just burial analysis in general. And there's a set of terms that we use to talk about the act of burying. Now, the act of burying is a really conscious thing. The person who died did not bury themselves, unless something really strange is going on, right? There's vampires or zombies or something going on. The person who died, and the people who were alive, who witnessed the death, are the ones who put that body in the burial. And so by studying the burial itself, we study the bones, we can learn about the person who died, but by studying the burial, we learn about the culture, the group who were still alive, who did the burying. And that's what we can study, or that's what we can learn when we study about burials. And there are a variety of ways that people were buried in the past, and we have a kind of a set of terminologies to discuss this kind of stuff. If you're buried in the ground with your bones and that kind of stuff, just like we think of being buried in the cemetery, the word we use for that is inhumation, meaning put into the ground, right? You can have either a primary inhumation or a secondary inhumation. By primary, what I mean is that the body was probably still fleshed when it was put into the ground, and as it decomposed, it was already covered with soil, and all the bones are in an anatomical position. And we can actually see that here. This body here is in primary articulated position, and this body over here is in primary articulated position. They were put on their side, flexed like this. This body over here is actually in secondary, disarticulated burial inhumation. So what happened was that this person, after they died, was somehow the flesh was removed from their body. This could be done by boiling, by exposing to the air, by letting hyenas or vultures. There are a variety of ways by which human bodies are defleshed in burial practices. And once all this happened, they then took the body from wherever it was exposed for this to happen, or maybe they dug the body up out of a first grave, and they repackaged it and reburied it, in this case probably on purpose, to be put with this other person. So this person over here was probably buried in this particular case, and in one location, and when this person died, they dug up the other person and laid them both to rest in the same inhumation together. So that's inhumation, that's burial of bones or bodies. The other one is cremation. We often do. These are the two most common disposal methods. Inhumation, burying in the ground, and cremation, burning the material. And then oftentimes the material is collected, put in a pot or a basket, and buried again. So it's sort of like being burned, cremated, and then buried. In some cultures, the cremation remains are left exposed. They're put into rivers or other bodies of water. And in other cultures, they do neither inhumation nor cremation. They just expose bodies and let them disintegrate and be picked apart by animals and that kind of stuff. So those are the three main ways that people get rid of human bodies, but they obviously don't just dispose of them. Most often they'll throw them in the trash heap, although that does happen from time to time. They purposefully do something with the remains after that. And actually, before I talk about that, we want to talk about articulation. So when we're talking about inhumations, and particularly this word articulated over here and disarticulated, what I meant by that is the degree to which the skeleton is in anatomical order. What does it look like? Does it look like this sort of Halloween skeleton looking over here, or is it all jumbled up? Okay, so that's what I meant by articulation. But when I talk about the burial practice itself, it actually informs about the prehistoric peoples their belief in an afterlife, or their belief in what they should do with the body anyway of their deceased members. So if it's a fairly simple affair, meaning they just lower the body into the ground, it's fully articulated, primary, a complete inhumation, that tells us something about their understanding about the body. Maybe the body is supposed to stay together, and it's important to go back to the earth, right? If there is a compound or complex burial, so that they expose the body and deflesh the flesh and only bury the bones, or if they bury it and dig it up later, if they ferment it or expose it to animals or do all this other stuff, that may suggest a more complicated understanding about the afterlife and the nature of the human body. And maybe that there are only certain parts of the body that are important. Maybe it's only the heart that they take out and bury, and they get rid of the rest of the body because it means nothing to them. Maybe it's really important to save the bones and to put them in a specific place because the bones have special meaning versus the flesh. So if burials themselves are more complex, that suggests a really interesting, different understanding about death and the afterlife. And in particular, especially complex burial rites may have extensive activities to prepare the body for death. Between the time of death and burial, you might have to do a lot of things with and to the body and with other grave goods in order to facilitate the passing of being alive to being dead, or going from this life to an afterlife. And there are a lot of things that people did in different cultures. Painting, clothing, intentional damage to the body, including all kinds of grave goods and all kinds of symbolic ritual behaviors of the living people that they did surrounding the death, and that we still do when we celebrate funerals, right? And some of these things leave marks in the graves, and we might be able to actually compare several different graves to see how individuals were treated differently after death, right? So maybe there is something in the culture that says, look, everyone's the same, even if they're a king in this life, we have to treat them the same because they're going to go to the same afterlife. So maybe that's interesting. But maybe there are people who are more important in life, and they need to be more important after death as well. So you need to do some special things, to give special sacrifices, to give special offerings to them during the burial, during the funeral ceremony, right? The grave will contain evidence of these things, and multiple graves, as we analyze this, will show these different kinds of individualities that existed in the past. So we look at the grave goods for sure, we look at a lot of other things. But one of the things we look at is actually the positioning of the bodies in the graveyard. Here's a famous triple burial from Dolne Vestinici. And this is a very intriguing positioning where two people are next to each other and another person sort of reaching over almost longingly towards them. There's a whole story that goes to this. But basically what we do is to look at the relationship of the actual body parts and different bodies to each other. For example, we would look, are the legs extended? Are the arms put at the side, or are they put above their head? Are they crossed over the front? Are the knees flexed? Is the whole body flexed? Is it on its side? Is it on its front? We have a whole set of terms, so things that we would say commonly on back. Our more archaeological scientific term would be supine or prone, sometimes reclining, dorsal, right? On the face, on the side. We say lateral, erect, vertical, erect, perpendicular. There's all kinds of particular terms that we would use to describe in a very standardized way. We have actually a checklist for burial. There's a handbook of burial analysis that you can just sort of follow through when you're doing this kind of stuff. And we would say, we would also record other things. So where is the individual's head? We need to note, for example, is it oriented in a cardinal direction? Is it facing a particular structure? Are the graves all oriented a specific way? Are the bodies oriented differently inside the grave than the hole that was dug out? Is it facing away versus its head pointing in a different way? What's the important factor? We need to be recording and all this kind of stuff. And here we have a couple of examples of that kind of thing. Here, where's the position of the body? We have to look at this pretty carefully, right? There's the head over here. There are the legs over here. Here's the backbone and the rib cage over here. And here's a mouth over here, right? So what happened? There was post-depositional processes. This particular burial's head was facing this way, off to the side, and its legs and stuff were flexed, and it was facing this way down to the side. So what do we say? What was the original position of this body? It's actually pretty difficult in some cases to actually know this kind of information, but we'll do our best by recording specific information, like where's the head, where are the legs, where's the spine, that kind of thing. And of course, we don't want to forget about all of the artifacts that very often go along with these burials. Being buried with lots of artifacts is an indication that people believe you need those artifacts after you're dead. And so by studying the types of artifacts, their frequency, the placement, condition, and all that kind of stuff, we actually understand a little bit more about the sequence of being buried. So I'm just going to end very briefly with a little vignette from some field work that I was involved in, site of Ayun al-Hammam in Jordan. This is a site from the Epipaleolithic period, the last period of hunter-gatherers before the end of the Ice Age. And there weren't very many burials known from this time period. In fact, I think there were only about 10, maybe less than 10 known from this time period. And when we went out to the field, I was working with my colleague who's now at Berkeley, Lisa Maher, who excavated the site. Now I was helping her. She had discovered that this was a habitation site that probably dated from this time period. We were not expecting to find burials. We were digging in what we call a midden, basically the trash heap of this site. And on our first season, we actually came up with a human tooth and a human arm bone. And we knew that this was going to change things, that this particular site may have the potential to yield burials from this very rare time period. And because of that, we called in a bioarchaeologist to help us do the excavation, because these bones are really fragile. This is a really old period. Bone preservation is not really good at the site. So we need to make sure we did this right. And when we excavated the site, we found something really interesting in one of the burials, this particular burial right here. This inhumation, like these other ones, laid out straight with the head pointed in one direction. But instead of the arms down at the side, this arm was sort of bent like this. And it was actually cradling something here. And when we excavated, or when Jay Stark, the bioarchaeologist from Cambridge, who excavated the burials for us, finally found what this object was, it turns out that this was a baby fox head that was in the crook of this person's arm. And these people were very simple hunter-gatherers, but they were doing really interesting things. When this person was buried, when they died, they probably sacrificed this fox, which is probably a pet, right? Probably a pet of this person, perhaps, when they are buried. This is really, really interesting. And we found other really interesting things in some of these burials. We found modified bone tools. We found caches of stone tools. And throughout the excavation, we were very, very careful to document the association of all of these interesting artifacts and the faunal remains that were in association when there was other faunal remains. So here's the head of a fox. Here's the body of maybe a different fox, or maybe the same fox that was dug up when they were reburying other people. And what was really interesting is that these people were buried on the site itself in what was probably where trash was being disposed, but these people were not being disposed of as trash. They were being buried on the site because the site was probably a very significant place. This perennial spring that was probably visited and revisited by these group of people over probably thousands of years, and they had a very close cultural tie to this particular location. And burying these people in this spot sort of laid claim to this area. And we see evidence of these people's individuality and maybe some notion of spirituality, that this fox that was buried with this person was maybe a sacrifice. 'Cause maybe this person was actually a little bit more important. Maybe they had an important role in society. Maybe they were a leader. Maybe they were a spiritual leader. We don't know the answer to these questions, but it's really intriguing. And analyzing these burials, Dr. Maher continues to work with this material with Dr. Stock, and we're learning incredible amounts about the people from this time period that we knew nothing about. All we knew about was their stone tools for the most part. And finding these burials really puts a common humanity to these people that was really missing in our research to this date. And for me, this experience, the experience of working on this particular site, was one of the most humanizing kind of experiences I've had in archaeology, of finding these ancient people buried 15,000 years ago, and to find the fact that they did something that's so touching, to be buried with this baby fox, really changed things. All right, so I am going to end the conversation here because my phone is ringing. So we'll see you next week.